verses 30 to 37. Leaving that region, they travelled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, and 3 days later he will rise from the dead." They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. After they arrived in Capernaum and settled in a house, Jesus asked his disciples, "What were you discussing out there on the road?" But they didn't answer, because they'd been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12 disciples over to him, and said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servant of everyone else." Then he put a little child among them. Taking the child in his arms, he said to them, "Anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me, but also my Father who sent me." This is the word of the Lord.
When it was announced that October Books in Southampton in the UK was moving a few doors up the road, 200 people turned up as volunteers. This community bookshop was moving and they needed volunteers to help. So helpers lined up along the footpath and formed a human chain, passing from person to person thousands of books, one by one, from person to person. Having witnessed what was going on for these volunteers in action, the store employee said it was a moving experience for everyone who was helping. They wanted to be part of something bigger. Isn't that a great idea? Well, I think that's really what joining the church and being a part of God's family and being a part of the big kingdom movement is about. Each of us wants to be a part of something that's really worth giving our hearts and lives to. God's kingdom movement, as it were. And God has each of us in mind to volunteer for this project in our own little patch. It's a great thought. Paul compared it, in fact, to building of growing a garden. Some of us plant seeds, while other of us water the seeds, still other of us pull up the weeds. At least we do in my garden at home. With God himself giving the growth. That's the important part. We do our bit, and it's up to God. We are, as Paul says, I mentioned this earlier, we are co-workers in God's service. 1 Corinthians 3:9. Isn't that amazing? That's an amazing thought, that we can be working together with God in his project to build his kingdom, his church. And the challenging thing is that God does much of the work in and through us, his family, through volunteers like you and me. God wants to use us working together, being united, having fellowship, being people of worship, and that takes humility, and it takes a commitment to serve him. It has to have a servant's heart. Generally, really that's what our passage in Mark 9 is about this morning. Jesus explains that he will serve, and then once he realises that his disciples have missed the point again, he puts a child in front of them and he tries to teach them about true greatness and about servanthood. So let's divide this passage into 3 parts. The first part is the disciples' confusion about Jesus' identity as the suffering Messiah. I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel a bit sorry for the disciples We get to know Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, but they were part of it. They were living it. And they seem to be a thick, slow-learning bunch, don't they? They constantly get it wrong. And Jesus has to be very patient with them, as he is with us, of course. So Jesus has been going around doing very extraordinary things. He's like walking on the water, forgiving sins, speaking to demons, calming fierce storms, feeding huge crowds, speaking in wonderful teaching, and sometimes confusing parables, rejecting the authority of the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees and so on. And so much of his teaching has multi-level meanings. Some of it is even in code, or in riddles, or in parables. And it seems to me that for every step forward the disciples make, the next step shows their confusion and their fears. Jesus is no easy figure to pin down or to be like. And every time they seem to be getting him, as it were, he says something which makes them think, oh, what's he mean now? So take, for example, Peter's confession, which just happened a few days before this story in Mark 9, because it's in Mark chapter 8, where they're at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus says, who do you people say that I am? And Peter makes the confession for them all. Oh, fantastic confession. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And that's a huge step forward for the disciples. He's the long-awaited Messiah, the King. And we readers breathe a sigh of relief for the disciples. Ah, guys, you've got it. Well done. Hurrah! But here in our passage, maybe just a few days later, Jesus tells them something that for them is very scary and puzzling. He says he's going up to Jerusalem, he's going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies, he will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise. Now, we've read to the end of Mark. We know what that means. But when they heard that in the first instance, it was really very puzzling to them. What does he mean? Is he speaking in riddles again? Is that a parable, or should we take it literally? And they didn't get it. They were so confused that they were afraid even to ask about it. What did Jesus mean? They kept thinking to themselves. Now, it's hard for us to understand their confusion. For us to do that, we have to jump back into the first century, into their shoes. You see, the most common reading of the Old Testament, in that reading, the Messiah will be a warrior king like David, who will beat the Goliath of the day, which is, for them, the Romans. He will be a military hero, and he will not be, in the least likely scenario, he will not be a murder victim of his enemies. That's impossible. The Jews of Jesus' day, when they thought the word Messiah, a murder victim at the hands of his enemies is just not on the cards. You get it? They just didn't think that way. The Messiah is God's hero. Now, let me try to illustrate that for today. Imagine Jesus forms a new soccer team, and he's the captain coach. The players come together and they start training. Coach Jesus is brilliant. He's unorthodox, but he's brilliant. He leads you in various games against various different opponents. First up with the Pharisees, then you have some demons that you beat. The Herodians come along, they get put aside as well. And so do the Sadducees and the possessed people. He wins every round. He's a bit of a superstar. But now imagine that he comes to you as the players of the team and he says, we've got an important match coming up. Hey guys, in this game I'm going to get tackled. My legs are going to be broken. I'll be carried off the field. In fact, they're going to put a major foul against me and I'll be red carded. And we'll be beaten. You'll be scattered. The team will be in chaos. But don't worry, I'll be back. Now you think to yourself now, the last little phrase means nothing if you've listened to the first few bits. No, 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 you say, as a soccer player. That can't happen. You're the captain coach and we win. You can't be red carded out of the game. You get the confusion? That's the type of confusion that the disciples were feeling. A Messiah who dies is inconceivable. The Apostle Paul said that was absolutely foolishness to the Greeks and a scandal to the Jews. No one in their day could believe a Messiah would be killed by his enemies. So it's no wonder they didn't understand. Too many times, I think, they have shown up their fears. This time, instead of speaking to Jesus about them, they stay silent. In a sense, we can learn from that. Maybe we've read something in Scripture or heard something that Jesus said or been told by somebody in church or heard a sermon, hopefully not from me, but heard a sermon that has caused you some real deep concerns and doubts. Maybe God is trying to say something to you and you're not sure. If so, are we open to changing our views? Or are we like the disciples, too afraid to ask? It's healthy to ask questions when we're scared or confused or puzzled. And if you have questions that are bothering you or upsetting you, please, John Martin can answer them all. Now, come and see me or John or one of the elders. We would love to talk it through with you if we can. We don't have all the answers, but we would love to pray with you if you've got any questions at all about what it means to follow Jesus. So unlike the disciples, it is healthy to ask and to discuss your questions. Secondly, who is the greatest? Well, God's greatest. Serve humbly. That's what the next few verses are about. As Jesus and the 12 walked towards Capernaum, trying to keep a low profile, the disciples had moved on from wondering what Jesus meant about dying and rising. Now they have reverted to thinking about Jesus being the Messiah, and that being, of course, our King. And that leads to the point of saying, well, if he's going to be a king, we need to find out where we sit. I want to sit on his right, says Peter. Oh, no, that's reserved for James and John, and so on and so forth. So they have a big debate about who's the greatest among them. And that's not a very healthy thing, because Jesus, when he sits them down inside the room, asks them about arguing. And so embarrassed, they feel like naughty little schoolboys, because they know in their heart of hearts that they really shouldn't have been arguing about who's the greatest. And so again, they stay silent and red-faced in their folly. Who is the greatest? Well, who's this guy? Who kept saying that for years and years and years? Cassius Clay, as he used to be called, or Muhammad Ali. He was a great boxer, you have to say that. Not that I think boxing's a good sport, but he was the greatest for many years. But then Joe Frazier came along and knocked him over. So he's no longer the greatest. He got up, of course, and came back and did a few other things, but other boxers beat him too. And so he made all these very proud, I am the greatest. You remember that one? I am the greatest. And he would get in the face of all his opponents, and very arrogant and proud guy. Now, if we think that by following King Jesus it's going to enhance our prestige or our social status or our reputation, or even if we think it's possibly going to help our bank balance, think again. Actually, it challenges us in all the opposite directions. As Jesus will reveal to his 12 buffet disciples, his thick ones. You know, we've got to think about us Australians and seeking status. That is the appearance of greatness. What do we use as guide sticks or yardsticks to our greatness? Well, Aussies tend to think of their homes, or their cars, or their clothes, or their career, or electronic gadgets as being status symbols. The Apple Watch, do you know the Apple Watch? When it was released a few years ago, it came in 3 different castings. There was the aluminium casting for $550. Next slide, Peter. And then there was the stainless steel for $1,000. And then there was this one. Guess how much this gold Apple Watch cost? $10,000. And do you think they sold 1 or 2 in Australia? No, they sold thousands of them. Why? Because people wanted to have the prestige and the status of having one of the new Apple Watches that was gold. You know, they would become obsolete in 2 to 3 years. And so the only conceivable need to buy a $10,000 gold watch of this version was status. To proclaim to the world that my money can be spent with no correlation at all to value. Yet hundreds of those gold watches were sold. What about an alternative story? It's a true one. A young single mum, that's not her, but it's just an illustration, wearily loaded up her trolley with items for her daughter's birthday. A few cupcakes, some bags of chips, a couple of soft drinks, some bags of lollies, and a few other items. And when she got to the counter, the assistant added up the amount and announced to her what it was, and her heart sank. She softly said to her little daughter, "I'm sorry, honey, you're going to have to put some of these back." Her daughter sobbed a bit and said, "But these are for my party." There, standing behind them in the line, was a lady who overheard the quiet conversation and recognised the mother's pain. She reached out, stepped forward and swiped her own credit card before the young mum could say anything, paying the whole bill. She just smiled at the little girl and said, "Enjoy your party, honey." To that mum, this was true greatness. A generous gesture when she needed it most. And I think that we could learn from that one rather than Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali. So it must have disappointed Jesus when his disciples didn't get him and they were arguing about things that he saw as red herrings. We can almost hear the sigh of anguish as Jesus' voice comes to them and he says what he says to them. And I guess we should say with the Apostle Paul, "But by the grace of God go I." We shouldn't just point the finger at the disciples. We should look into our own hearts. How can Jesus get the message across to them and to us? Jesus says to them, "Guys," and I would say that to us all, "whoever wants to be first must take last place, and to be the servant of everyone else." Gee, that's challenging, isn't it? You just think about those words. Whoever wants to be first must take last place and be the servants of everyone else. Boy, that is against human nature, or the old nature anyway. Following Jesus is not about gaining status. It's about serving with great compassion. I'll say that again. Following Jesus is not about gaining great status. It's about serving with great compassion, as Jesus himself did. Remember what the Apostle Paul said to his friends at Galatia. Let's not get tired of doing good deeds. At just the right time we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up doing them. Therefore, whenever we have opportunity, we should do good to everyone. Boy, that's challenging, isn't it? But it's consistent throughout Scripture, this message of servanthood. True greatness is not found in being at the top, but serving at the bottom. Let me tell you a story, it's true. I've got a picture of him even. This guy's name is Maury Bogard. He was mainly confined to bed for the last 15 years of his life. He lived in the United States, in the northern state called Michigan, right up there on the Canadian border. Now, for more than half the year, the temperature overnight was well below freezing. And that, realised Maury, was a dangerous situation for the many thousands of homeless people who lived in his hometown. So instead of focusing on his own health and his own limitations, Maury, with the aid of his local church, decided to try and help. He learnt to, and he began knitting. And he knitted beanies for the homeless. You can see one there on his chest. Over the next 15 years, he knitted 8,000 beanies. 8,000! And instead of complaining about the boredom or the repetitiveness of that, he shone for Jesus. He decided that his work made him contribute to the bigger project of the kingdom. And the Lord's work was important for him. He said, and this is a quote, I'm going to do this until I go home to the Lord. At 92, he went home in 2018. He was 91 then, still knitting. So grateful were the many thousands of recipients of his beanies that Maury's testimony is now inspiring people all over the world. His simple act of kindness is kingdom servanthood at its best. My third point is in verses 36 and 37 that Jesus illustrates humility using a child. And so to jolt them out of their worldly thinking about who is the greatest, Jesus uses a child as a teaching aid. They didn't have these data projectors in those days, so they had to have a visual aid. And Jesus was brilliant at that. And he chose this little child. You know what? They're in a house in Capernaum. Who lives in Capernaum? And whose house were they often in? Peter. Do you know, was Peter married? Yes. I wonder if he had children. Maybe this child in this house was Peter's child. It's just a thought. We don't know. Mark doesn't tell us. But children in those days, like it was in Australia maybe 50 years ago, were loved by their families, but to be seen but not heard. They were people who had no social status. They had no greatness. They weren't looked up to. In fact, they were to learn and to serve in humility. That was the child's role. Jesus wants us to turn our thinking upside down so that even a child can be great in God's kingdom. The 12, even though they were his chosen 12 disciples and apostles, are not promised any greatness because of that. Verse 37 says, and I want you to focus on the word anyone with this. Verse 37 says, anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf welcomes me, and anyone who welcomes me welcomes not only me but my Father who sent me. Notice the focus on anyone. Anyone can be great in God's kingdom. You and me. True greatness is found in ways that enable everyone to join Jesus' family, the royal family, if you like. It's open to everyone. That's to you and me. Isn't that exciting? Let me conclude. Jesus' embrace of this little child is good news for us all. Even when we're muddled or when we're afraid, as children often are, Jesus welcomes us even when we don't understand everything. He is still a loving, compassionate, kind, saying, "Come, follow me." And so today we need not fear about opening up our questions or admitting our confusion or our fears even. Why? Because he is the one whose perfect love casts out all fear. 1 John 4:18. This story closes with Jesus embracing a child, the ultimate symbol of non-status. And children have untold irrational fears, don't they? But Jesus embraces us like that child. He offers the same to us today. And on the other side of the coin, Jesus invites us to look beyond ourselves, to look out with compassion and to serve as he did. Whoever wants to be great must take last place and be the servant of others. Verse 35. And the Apostle Paul adds, "My brothers and sisters, you have been called to live in freedom. So don't use your freedom to satisfy your old nature. Instead, serve one another in love." Serve one another in love. So let's ask ourselves as we go into this week, what can I volunteer to do for the Lord that links me to people in need? What can I do to volunteer for the Lord that links me with people in need? And I challenge us all, including myself, to think through that one. Our third song today takes up this theme again of serving one another. As brothers and sisters, brother, sister, let me serve you. It used to be brothers, let me be your servant. But it's inclusive now. And so let's stand and sing this beautiful song, Brother, Sister, Let Me Serve You. Thanks, John.